Qatar recently said it's working hard to find a way to get Israeli hostages back to safety. Admirable thing until you realize that the head of Hamas is living in Qatar, in its capital, Doha. He regularly spends $1 million a day on luxurious hotel stays and spa days, all funded by the Qatari government. In 2012, Qatar gave $400 million to Hamas, and since then, they have been sending $30 million per month to Hamas. In total, Qatar has sent over $1 billion disguised as aid, same aid that Hamas used to plan and carry out the October 7th attack. Now, Qatar wants to play peacemaker and help Israel negotiate with the same terrorists for the hostages. This situation isn't even unique. Qatar also houses Taliban while helping US negotiate with Taliban leaders. Qatar also has links to Al-Qaeda and Houthis. It also houses Egyptian militants named Muslim Brotherhood. This all makes you wonder, how can a nation that's a major US ally in the war against terror is also such a strong supporter of terror groups around the world? Well, it all has to do with Qatar's need to stay relevant and, more importantly, stay free. To understand Qatar's true motives, we have to go back a little to 1990, the year when Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
Saddam Hussein. He sends his 1 million man strong army to invade his tiny Arab neighbor, Kuwait.
This killing and others caused many people to flee the country and criticize and oppose this regime from overseas.
The element of surprise ensured that effective Kuwaiti resistance ended within just 12 hours, after which Saddam triumphantly proclaimed that Kuwait was now the 19th province of Iraq.
But before jumping in real quick, please hit the like button below. YouTube has been extra strict on videos that cover Israel-Hamas war, because these types of videos are not advertiser friendly. So that means your like helped the video out tremendously in the algorithm. Now let's start. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Qatar quickly realized that it could face the same fate. It was a small nation, just like Kuwait. It had the modern day gold and oil, just like Kuwait. And it had a big adversary in Saudi Arabia, just like Kuwait had Iraq. This worry wasn't without reason. Qatar and Saudi Arabia already had multiple border skirmishes, and to Qatar it seemed like it was only a matter of time before Saudi invaded. Ever since then, Qatar had one goal: to make itself useful and powerful. Qatar quickly realized that it had to become powerful, and more importantly, it also realized that money alone doesn't make you powerful. Luckily, money does help. So, when in 1995, Emir Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani carried out a bloodless coup against his father, his first order of business was to transform Qatar from a sleepy backwater into a dynamic new powerful state. Qatar had two things going for it. First, it was an absolute monarchy with no domestic dissent, so leaders didn't need to worry about losing power come next election like democratic leaders in the free countries. This made it possible for officials to plan decades ahead and even pursue controversial policies without worrying about how they play at home. Second thing, did I mention that Qatar has money? And I mean boatload of money. By late 1990s, Qatar was one of the biggest exporter of oil, gas and LNG. Government was swimming in money, and for a small population of just 200,000 people, everyone was filthy rich. One thing about rich people is they tend not to start civil wars or overthrow the government. So that was a big problem solved for Qatari monarch. On top of this, they built a sovereign fund that would rival the biggest hedge funds of the time. As of today, this fund has almost $500 billion under management. With that kind of money, you can buy a lot of influence. But we are getting ahead of the story a little, so let's back up. Another important decision Qatar made in 1990s is to partner with the USA, the strongest military in the world. In 1996, Qatar built Al Udeid Air Base to house the US military in Qatar. This cost more than $1 billion at the time to build, but the base existence was kept secret from the public until 2002. After the 9/11 attack, this base played a wider role in the US invasion of Iraq and since then, it has become the largest US base in the Middle East. But Qatar wasn't just playing the US side in the Iraq War. Qatari-funded Al Jazeera was one of the toughest critics of the US during this war. Al Jazeera's coverage was so graphic that Colin Powell, who was the US Secretary of State at the time, made an official complaint to the Qatari government during a press conference. Powell said that the channel's coverage of the war has clouded the relationship between US and Qatar. This did put the Qatari leader in a tough position, as he had put more than $100 million into Al Jazeera with the sole goal of providing independent coverage. But Qatar was achieving the goal that Emir had set out almost a decade ago. Qatar was finally becoming relevant and important on a national stage. The US Secretary of State complained about the Qatari news channel, but he couldn't do much more than that, because Qatar was just too important of an US ally to cut ties or put any real pressure. Slowly but surely, Qatar was becoming more powerful and more relevant, but it was still nowhere close to where Qatari leaders wanted it to be. That opportunity was presented during the Arab Spring. Do you guys remember how earlier I mentioned that Qatari leaders are not really worried about internal dissent because the population is small and rich? Well, that's not the case for the rest of the Arab countries. In the 2010s, a new anti-government movement started spreading in the Arab world. People rose up against the corrupt and authoritarian rules and in many cases, overthrew the government. It started in Tunisia in 2010. Authorities approached a working-class vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, for selling produce without permit. Officers drunk on power refused to follow procedure for this kind of misdemeanor, confiscated his produce, and humiliated him in front of the public. Then, when Mohammed went on to complain to the higher-ups about officers' harassment, he was ignored and mistreated again. So, in a protest of the government's abuse of power, Bouazizi stood in front of the government's office and set himself on fire. Thus began the Arab Spring. His death kicked off a nationwide protest against the government and President Zine al-Abidine. Just a week after protests started, the government collapsed and the president was forced to flee the country. The speed at which everything unfolded shocked the world. As the news spread to the other Arab nations, it gave the public under authoritarian rules some hope, and it scared the shit out of the authoritarian leaders of other nations. Slowly, protests started picking up all around the Arab nations. This is where Qatar comes back into the story. Since 2011, Qatar has adopted an approach that has largely embraced these political changes in the region, and Qatari government has sought to engage a wide range of actors, particularly Islamists such as the Muslim Brotherhood. It also backed calls for political change in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and Syria. On top of this, it took on a very active role in efforts to remove leaders from power in Libya and Syria. This approach stands in sharp contrast to that of Saudi Arabia, which was more reserved and generally slower in its response. In Egypt, for example, Saudi Arabia opposed the quick political changes, backed former President Hosni Mubarak, and criticized countries that supported his removal from the office. The differences between Qatari and Saudi approach to the Middle East uprising have less to do with ideology and more to do with domestic politics. As I mentioned 2 times before, Qatar is small and rich, while Saudi Arabia is much larger and faces greater prospects for internal dissent. Saudi leaders worried that if Arab Spring continued, they could be next on the chopping block. That's why Saudis have opposed these government changes very aggressively, often going as far as funding the government to help them stay in power. There's also another theory that explains the Saudi-Iran Cold War that can also apply to Saudi-Qatar conflict. Saudi Arabia is widely seen as the leader of the Muslim world. As an incumbent leader, they don't want other countries' leadership to change. Change is unpredictable, and if you're on top, you don't want unpredictability. But Qatar, on the other hand, is a rising power who wants change. Because Qatar believes if they play their cards right, they can be more powerful with all this chaos. This is why Qatar is a big supporter of the Egyptian group Muslim Brotherhood, same group that gave birth to Hamas in Gaza. Muslim Brotherhood allegedly won Egypt's first real presidential vote in 2012. The next year, when the Egyptian military took power in a coup, Saudi Arabia and its allies awarded the new rulers a $12 billion aid package, and the Muslim Brotherhood was kicked out of Egypt. But they found a home in Qatar, where government welcomed them with open arms. Qatar also houses Taliban and Hamas. On top of this, they also fund Hezbollah and Taliban-affiliated groups. Usually, Qatar backs the anti-government groups, but that's not always the case. Same thing with Saudis. Usually, they back the incumbent government, but that's not always the case. For both Qatar and the Saudis, the goal is to back the side that is likely to be loyal to them, then make sure they win in their war. Perfect examples of this can be seen in Yemen and Syria. In Syria, Saudis are actually backing the Sunni rebel groups against Assad's government, which is backed by Qatar and Saudi's sworn enemy Iran. But as we move a little bit to the south, we find Saudis backing Yemeni government against the Qatar-backed Houthi groups. The Saudi-Qatar Cold War got so bad in 2017 that it escalated to multilateral conflict. Saudi Arabia, along with 5 other Arab nations, cut all diplomatic ties with Qatar and even blockaded the nation from getting supplies through its only land border. Luckily, Qatar is rich and they just started flying in supplies. But nevertheless, this was a big deal. Saudi Arabia accused Qatar of financing terrorism against Saudis. Egypt agreed with Saudi as Muslim Brotherhood was born in Egypt but has been kept alive by Qatar funding. Saudi demanded that Qatar cut these fundings and shut down Al Jazeera, which has been a bother to the Saudi royal family because of their negative reporting on the country. This was a crisis never before in Middle East. Citizens at all levels suffered, and nations on both sides went on the offensive to blame the other side, which just hurt the chances of a resolution even more. Even with a brutal blockade and being surrounded by enemies, Qatar didn't bend. Luckily, it still had the support of the US and the West as a whole, since the West was in a state of balancing Saudi and Qatar. After 4 long years, Saudi was finally forced to end its blockade due to other geopolitical issues, and Qatar didn't have to make any compromises. This once again showed the Qatari government that its foreign policy of being the world's mediator is working. It went through and survived pressure from its strongest adversary, all the while not giving up an inch in negotiations. Since then, Qatar has continued playing negotiator role while engaging with both sides. In 2014, Qatar brokered the release of a US sergeant captured by Taliban in exchange for 5 Taliban soldiers. In 2020, Qatar helped negotiate the US Taliban deal for USA's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then just this year, Qatar has helped negotiate the release of Ukrainian children captured by Russia and also negotiate release of 5 Americans held by Iran. These are just few examples of many deals Qatar has negotiated. Safe to say, Qatar was becoming more and more relevant and more important on the world stage. Now this all brings us to Israel and Hamas. In 2012, Qatar Emir visited Gaza with Hamas leaders. Qatar's government then decided to give Hamas $400 million to develop Gaza, which I'm not gonna lie, they probably did use some of that money for public services like hospitals and schools, but most of that money definitely didn't go to the public. I'm sure because here's one of the Hamas leaders saying that their job is to help Hamas soldiers, not Gaza citizens. But Qatar didn't care. After that $400 million, Qatar has been sending Hamas $30 million a month in form of aid. On top of this, the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, and many other top leaders are not even in Gaza. They are living in Doha, just a few miles away from the biggest US base in the Middle East. Western nations and Israel have always complained about Qatar's open support of Hamas, a terrorist group. But Qatar always claimed that having Hamas in the country helps them negotiate during turbulent times like now. Qatar recently helped Israel negotiate the release of 4 hostages from Gaza. In fact, before the attack, Israel would happily allow Qatar's aid to pass through to Gaza because Israel believed it would help keep the status quo and peace. But Ever since the October 7th attacks, many nations, including Israel and United States, have voiced their concern around Qatar's support of Hamas. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said that Israel's stated goal is to destroy Hamas, but Qatar's goal is the exact opposite, to save Hamas. While Anthony Blinken, US Secretary of State, said that there is no business as usual when it comes to Hamas. Now, Qatar's foreign policy faces its greatest test yet. Even with stern comments mentioned before, Israel and the West are hoping that Qatar can somehow negotiate the release of hostages at a price Israel is willing to pay. A two-sentence tweet by Israel's national security advisor has revealed the acute dilemma Israel and the West face in dealing with Qatar. Taki Hanegbi wrote, "I'm pleased to say that Qatar is becoming an essential party and stakeholder in the facilitation of humanitarian solution. Qatar's diplomatic efforts are crucial at a time like this. No matter how unhappy the world is with Qatar's support of terrorism, it most definitely is counting on Qatar to fulfill the other side of the trade. For the longest time, Qatar has claimed that the only reason it engages with terrorists is to help negotiate resolutions in times like this. Now is the time to deliver on those claims. If it can secure the release of all hostages in Gaza at a price Israel is willing to pay, it will be the star of the show. But equally, if the hostage communication collapses, its claim that it kept in touch with terrorists for negotiation will look weak, and it may lose the support and importance it so desperately needs on the world stage to keep the Saudis off its back."